This experiment that's about to be conducted, also known as the Little Albert experiment, is based off the ideas of John Watson, the psychologist who first introduced behaviorism.
Watson believed that classical conditioning can explain all human aspects of psychology.
Watson also believed that different experiences and behavior were due to different experiences in learning.
The premise of this experiment, classical conditioning, can be defined as a process of learning that associates stimuli with responses.
This is first seen through Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning experiment, where he taught dogs to salivate to a bell.
Watson hoped to use these principles in order to teach an infant to associate an unconditioned response, fear, with an unlikely stimulus, a rat. The purpose of this experiment is to show the effects classical conditioning can have on a developing mind, for example, child action.
Can we as psychologists have the power to make a child fear anything we desire with the power of conditioning?
Will a child respond to a stimulus that will imprint fear on them for the rest of their lives?
Potential long-term effects and harms be considered and deemed ethical before the experiment is allowed to proceed. And if not, is the psychologist still responsible for what may happen to the child in the future?
These questions will be answered during the process of the Little Albert experiment.
In this original test, John Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner were experimenting on a 9-month-old baby that they called Albert. Albert was a mentally sound child who had no known fears to any of the animals used in the experiment due to his young age. In the beginning, Albert is exposed to a white rat as the main stimulus. Little Albert's reaction to the rat is what ultimately will determine the success of Watson's experiment. After exposure to the rat, other similar animals are introduced to Albert in order to study the effects of generalization in terms of conditioning. As expected, Albert showed no fear to any of these animals. When Albert was exposed to the white rat a second time and touched it, Dr. Watson struck a metal beam with a hammer, creating a loud noise that frightened baby Albert. He learned to associate the loud noise with the rat, an example of effective conditioning. After the pairing was repeated several times, the rat was given to baby Albert without the striking of metal and was still afraid. Watson then brought in the other animals that were similar to the rat, and Albert was afraid again due to the principles of generalization.
After watching this experiment, it is apparent that this is not a moral experiment. The real little Albert could still have fears of little animals, and this could have affected his entire life. In our case, we only acted out what was supposed to happen because it would have been morally wrong to do all these experiments on a developing brain. Actually completing this experiment would have been a decision we regretted. However, had this been real, the child would have reacted in the same ways we show. So, was the input to our knowledge of psychology worth hurting a life? The answers we have taken away, however important, have influenced psychological experiments and humanitarian guidelines from then on.